A single text message sent to the wrong 10 digits at 2 a.m. is usually just an embarrassing mistake. For Wren Ashcroft, it was the moment her entire life split cleanly into a before and an after. She thought she was ending things with a cruel, wealthy boyfriend. She had no idea she had just introduced herself to a man who buried his enemies in the foundations of the buildings he owned. Some wrong numbers just get you an apology text back. Hers got her a black car parked outside her apartment by sunrise. The hospital break room smelled like burnt coffee and hand sanitizer, the same way it had every night for the last 3 years. Wren sat hunched over a scarred plastic table, still in her light blue scrubs, the fabric soft and thin from 100 industrial washes. Her sneakers had a dark stain near the left toe that would never fully come out, blood from a trauma bay she didn't want to think about right now. It was 1:52 in the morning, the dead hour, the hour when the emergency room finally exhaled and the hallway monitors settled into their slow, steady rhythm. She had 11 minutes left on her break, and she intended to spend every single one of them ending things with Bradley Kane. Her phone sat in her palm, the screen brightness turned down low so it wouldn't wake the 2 other nurses dozing against the vending machine. She had drafted the text 4 times already, deleting each attempt because it sounded either too angry or too pathetic, and she refused to be either one of those things for him. Not anymore. Bradley Kane didn't hit her. He didn't need his hands for cruelty. He had money for that. He'd pointed out the coffee stain on her scrubs in front of his business partners at a rooftop dinner she couldn't afford a taxi to get to. He'd told her, more than once, that nursing was a nice hobby for her to have until she figured out what she actually wanted to do with her life. He paid for things loudly and reminded her of it quietly, in the small ways that left marks nobody could see on an X-ray. She was done. She had been done for 3 weeks, ever since he canceled on her mother's funeral because a deal in Singapore needed his signature and sent a fruit basket instead. The fruit basket still sat on her kitchen counter, mostly rotten now, because she couldn't bring herself to touch it. Wren typed the message with her thumb, her heart hammering the way it did before she started a difficult IV. Bradley, I'm done. I don't want to see you again. Please don't call me. I mean it this time. She stared at it for a long moment. It was clean. It was final. It was exactly 23 words, and every single one of them was true. She hit send before she could talk herself out of it, and immediately felt her shoulders drop 2 inches, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying for months finally loosening in her spine. She set the phone face down on the table, closed her eyes, and allowed herself 30 seconds of feeling like a person who had just done something brave. She didn't know it yet, but her thumb had betrayed her. 3 weeks earlier, a wrong number had texted her about a dry cleaning pickup, and her phone, helpfully, had saved the contact as Bradley K., an autocorrect she'd never bothered to fix. The real Bradley Kane, the cruel one, the rich one, was still saved 2 contacts down as Bradley, do not answer. Her thumb, exhausted and running on 11 hours of trauma call, had picked the wrong one. The message had gone to a number registered to a man named Enzo Moretti. Enzo was sitting in the back office of a shuttered dockside warehouse when his phone buzzed against the dark wood of his desk. It was 2 a.m., and he was still awake because sleep had become a luxury he rationed carefully, like a man conserving fuel on a long, dangerous road. 2 of his men stood near the door, waiting on him to finish reviewing a set of shipping manifests that didn't add up the way they should have. He glanced at the screen out of habit, the same flat, assessing glance he gave every notification, expecting a supplier, a lawyer, one of his captains with bad news that couldn't wait until morning. Instead, he read, "Bradley, I'm done. I don't want to see you again. Please don't call me. I mean it this time." He read it twice. He did not know a Bradley. He had never, in 34 years of life, been anyone's Bradley, and the sheer unlikeliness of the message pulled something rare out of him. A small, genuine laugh, low in his chest, the kind his men rarely got to witness. "Something funny, boss?" asked Salvatore, the older of the two men by the door, a slab of a man with a nose that had been broken enough times to lose its original shape. "Somebody just broke up with the wrong man," Enzo said, turning the phone slightly so the dim desk lamp caught the screen. He didn't show it to Salvatore. He set it back down, studying the number. It wasn't in his contacts. It wasn't a number that had ever reached him before, not through the careful layers of screening his organization kept around him, which meant it was exactly what it looked like, an honest mistake, a stray thread accidentally pulled loose from somebody else's life. He should have let it go. A man in his position let 100 small oddities pass through his hands every week without a second thought. But there was something about the bluntness of it. "I mean it this time." The tired resignation folded into those 4 words that snagged on him and refused to let go. He typed a reply before he'd fully decided to. "Wrong Bradley, but for what it's worth, whoever he is, he's an idiot." He set the phone down, went back to the manifests, and told himself he was done with it. Wren's phone buzzed against the break room table 30 seconds later. She frowned at it, certain it was Bradley calling to argue, already composing the next thing she'd say in her head. Instead, she found a text from an unfamiliar number, and her stomach dropped through the floor. "Oh my God," she typed back immediately, sitting bolt upright. "I am so sorry. I sent that to the wrong number. Please ignore that. I'm so embarrassed." "Nothing to apologize for," came the reply, fast, unhurried. "Sounds like Bradley's loss." Wren stared at her screen, a strange, disoriented laugh bubbling up in her throat despite herself. She glanced around the empty break room as if someone might catch her smiling at a stranger's text at 2 a.m. Whoever this was, they had a dry, easy confidence in 4 words that made her feel, for just a second, less like a woman who'd spent the last 3 weeks crying into hospital-grade paper towels. "Well, thank you for the vote of confidence," she typed. "I promise I'm not usually this dramatic with strangers." "You weren't dramatic with a stranger," the reply came. "You were honest with the wrong number. There's a difference." She should have stopped there. She knew she should have stopped there, the way you know you should stop eating the whole sleeve of crackers but don't. Instead, she found herself typing, half out of nerves and half out of a loneliness she hadn't let herself examine too closely. "I should probably let you get back to your night. Sorry again." "Don't be. It's the most interesting thing that's happened to me all week," he wrote back. "Good night, wrong number." She put the phone face down on the table, pressed both hands flat against her cheeks, and sat there in the fluorescent hum of the break room feeling absurdly, inexplicably lighter than she had in a month. She had no way of knowing that the man on the other end of that message ran 3 ports, half the trucking routes on the east side of the city, and a network of men who would kill for him without asking why. She had no way of knowing his name was Enzo Moretti, and that the last woman who had accidentally learned that name had ended up in a witness protection file 2 states away, just to be safe. She just knew that a stranger had made her laugh on the worst month of her life, and that felt, for a few careless seconds, like enough. Bradley Kane called her 4 times over the next 2 hours. She let all 4 go to voicemail. When her shift finally ended at 7 a.m., she walked out into the gray, indifferent light of a city morning, her scrubs wrinkled, her feet aching in a way that had become permanent sometime during her 2nd year of nursing, and she felt, for the first time in weeks, like she might actually survive her own life. She did not text the wrong number again. She told herself that was the mature thing to do, closing a strange, funny little door before it became something complicated. She went home to her apartment on the 4th floor of a building with a broken elevator and a landlord who answered maintenance requests roughly as often as the moon turned blue, and she slept until 2 in the afternoon with her phone on silent. She woke up to 9 missed calls from Bradley and 1 single text from the wrong number. Hope the rest of your night went better than the start of it. She stared at that message for a long time before she let herself smile. 2 days passed in the ordinary, grinding rhythm of Ren's life. 12-hour shifts, a bus that was always either 5 minutes early or 20 minutes late, a refrigerator with exactly enough food in it if she was careful, and rent that ate more of her paycheck than she liked to do the math on. She didn't hear from Bradley again after the 9th unanswered call, which told her everything she needed to know about how much their 2 years together had actually meant to him. Men who loved you called a 10th time. Men who owned you simply found someone new to own. She did hear, once more, from the wrong number. A single line on a Tuesday evening, unprompted. Hope work's treating you better than Bradley did. She didn't know how to explain, even to herself, why that small, unasked-for kindness from a total stranger sat warmer in her chest than 2 years of expensive dinners had ever managed to. She typed back, "Work is exhausting, but at least the patients don't send fruit baskets instead of showing up." She hit send before she could second-guess it, and felt her face go hot the second it left her thumb. "That bad, huh?" came the reply. "Worse," she wrote. "But I don't really talk about my ex with strangers. No offense." None taken. For what it's worth, I don't usually text strangers either. Then why me? There was a longer pause this time, long enough that she set the phone down and made herself a cup of instant coffee she didn't really want, just to have something to do with her hands. When it buzzed again, the answer was simple, and it landed somewhere low and unguarded in her chest. "You sounded tired of being unhappy. I liked that you did something about it." Ren read that sentence 4 times. She thought about Bradley telling her nursing was a nice hobby. She thought about the fruit basket rotting on her counter. She thought about how long it had been since anyone had noticed anything about her except what she could be useful for, and she typed back before she could stop herself. "That might be the nicest thing anyone said to me in a year." "Then the people in your life have been doing a bad job," he wrote. She didn't know his name yet. She hadn't asked, some careful part of her not wanting to, as if not knowing kept the whole exchange safely unreal, a daydream she could close out of at any time. But that night, lying in her narrow bed with the radiator clanking against the cold outside, she found herself smiling at her ceiling like a teenager and let herself have that without asking what it meant. The thing about wrong numbers, Enzo thought, sitting in the leather chair of his study 3 nights later with a glass of untouched scotch sweating a ring onto the side table, was that they came with no history and no leverage. He knew everything about everyone who mattered to him. He knew which of his captains skimmed off the top and which ones would die before they touched a cent that wasn't theirs. He knew the private phone numbers of 2 city councilmen and 1 federal judge. He did not know this woman's last name, her face, or a single fact about her beyond the fact that she worked exhausting hours and had just walked away from a man who didn't deserve her attention. It was, he was beginning to admit to himself, exactly why he kept texting her. His organization did not run on sentiment. He had learned that lesson from his father, a lineage of Morettis who understood that affection was a door left open for men with knives. Enzo did not have friends, not really. He had allies, employees, and enemies, and the lines shifted depending on who was making money and who was costing it. A stranger with a wrong number and an honest, exhausted voice didn't fit into any of those categories, and that unfamiliarity was, against every instinct trained into him since childhood, deeply appealing. "You're smiling at your phone again," said Marco, his younger cousin and the closest thing Enzo had to a second-in-command, dropping into the chair across the desk without being invited. Marco had a loose, easy manner that Enzo tolerated because it was useful, a way of reading rooms Enzo himself had no patience for. "That's the third time this week." "Mind your business, Marco." "You never smile at your phone. You barely tolerate your phone. Last month you threw one into the harbor because a supplier texted you during dinner." "That supplier was late on a shipment and lying about it." "So what's she late on?" Enzo set the glass down without drinking from it, fixing his cousin with a flat look that had ended arguments with far more dangerous men than Marco. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing. You've got a face on you I haven't seen since before your father died." Marco leaned forward, some of the easy humor dropping out of his voice. "I'm not telling you to stop. God knows you could use something that isn't a ledger or a war. I'm telling you to be careful. You know what happens to people who get close to us." Enzo didn't answer that because he didn't have a good answer. He knew exactly what happened to people who got close to men like him. He had buried two of them already, an uncle and a cousin, both killed by rivals who understood that the fastest way to hurt a man like Enzo Moretti was never to come at him directly. It was to come at whoever he'd made the mistake of caring about. He looked at his phone again anyway. Then he typed, "Can I ask your name?" The reply came 20 minutes later, 20 minutes he spent staring at a shipping manifest without absorbing a single number on it. "Ren, and I still don't know yours." "Enzo," he wrote back, and felt something settle in his chest that he didn't have a word for, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Enzo," she wrote. "That's a nice name. Very Italian mafia boss." He looked at that sentence for a long time, an unfamiliar, wry amusement pulling at the corner of his mouth. "You have no idea," he typed, and then deleted it, because some jokes were only funny if the other person never learned they were true. He sent, instead, "My grandfather's name, family tradition." "I like it," she wrote. "Feels like it belongs to someone steady." If she only knew, he thought, and put the phone face down on the desk, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, allowed himself to want something that had nothing to do with territory or money or blood. Bradley Kane did not take rejection well. It had never happened to him before. Not really. Not from a woman who had nothing and owed him, in his own accounting of things, quite a lot. He had paid for her rent twice when she was short. He had taken her to restaurants where the tasting menu cost more than her weekly paycheck. He considered these things investments, and investments, in Bradley's worldview, were owed a return. He showed up at the hospital on a Thursday evening, waiting in the parking garage in his black Mercedes, watching the staff entrance the way a man watches a door he still believes belongs to him. Ren spotted the car before she recognized the driver, and her stomach dropped in a slow, sick way she'd hoped she was done with. He rolled the window down as she approached her bus stop, keeping pace with her at a slow crawl along the curb. "You've been ignoring me." "That was the point of the text, Bradley." "You don't get to just disappear on me, Ren. Not after everything I've done for you." She kept walking, her bag heavy on her shoulder, her feet aching from 12 hours on a hospital floor, and she didn't look at him. "You didn't do anything for me that you didn't remind me of 100 times. I'm done. Please stop following me." "I'm not following you. I'm talking to you. There's a difference." He said it with the exact same cold, clipped confidence he'd used the night he told her nursing was a hobby, and something in her chest went hot with an anger she hadn't let herself feel in 2 years of small, accumulated humiliations. "Go home, Bradley." He didn't. He pulled the car in front of her, forcing her to stop walking, and got out, standing in the orange wash of the streetlight with his tailored coat and his expensive watch and his face arranged into the particular expression of a man who had never once in his life been told no and meant it. "You're being ridiculous. Get in the car. We'll talk about this like adults." "I am talking about it like an adult," Ren said, her voice shaking slightly, more from anger now than fear. "I'm saying no. That's a complete sentence." He reached for her arm. It wasn't violent, not exactly, more the reflexive grip of a man used to steering people where he wanted them, but her whole body flinched back from it hard enough that her bag slid off her shoulder and hit the pavement. A man passing on the sidewalk slowed, glancing between them, and Bradley straightened, aware suddenly of the audience, and let his hand drop. "This isn't over," he said, low, and got back into his car and drove off into the gray evening traffic, leaving Ren standing on the curb with her heart hammering and her bags scattered across the sidewalk. She picked her things up with shaking hands, and by the time she got home, the fear had curdled into something colder and more useful: certainty. She was never getting back into a car with that man again, not for any reason, not even if the sky was falling. She didn't tell Enzo about it that night. She told herself it wasn't his business, that a stranger from a wrong number didn't need to hear about her ex-boyfriend's parking garage tantrum. But she found herself typing to him anyway, later, unable to keep the small tremor out of the words even through a phone screen. "Bad night?" he asked, before she'd even said anything, as if he could read it in the silence between her usual messages and this one. "My ex showed up at my work. It was nothing. I handled it." There was a pause long enough that she wondered if she'd said too much, if she'd finally been strange enough to scare off the one bright, easy thing she'd had in weeks. Then, "Did he touch you?" "Not really. He grabbed my arm. I pulled away. I'm fine, Enzo." Another pause. When the reply came, it was shorter than his usual messages, and something in its brevity made the hair on her arm stand up, though she couldn't have said why. "What's his last name?" "Why does that matter?" "It doesn't. I'm just curious what kind of man thinks that's an acceptable way to talk to someone." She didn't tell him. Some instinct, quiet and old, told her not to, though she couldn't have explained it to anyone, least of all herself. Instead, she wrote, "I don't need anyone to fight my battles for me. I've got it handled." "I believe you," he wrote back. "Doesn't mean I have to like it." She fell asleep that night with her phone on her chest, feeling, for reasons she didn't examine too closely, cared for in a way that had nothing to do with money or restaurants or watches that cost more than her rent. She didn't know that 400 miles of shipping routes, 2 city councilmen, and a dozen men with steady hands and short tempers were now quietly, invisibly oriented around finding out exactly who Bradley Kane was. It took Enzo's people less than a day. Bradley Kane, it turned out, was the junior partner at a boutique investment firm his father had founded, a man with a taste for expensive watches and a spotless public reputation that concealed, according to 2 separate sources, a habit of treating the women in his life the way he treated his stock portfolio, as assets to be managed and discarded when their value declined. Enzo did not go to Bradley's office. He did not send men to break windows or deliver threats. That wasn't how he operated. Instead, he made 2 phone calls, the kind that moved money and reputations rather than fists, and by Friday morning, Bradley Kane had been quietly, unofficially informed by 3 separate business contacts that his firm's continued access to a particular shipping company's freight contracts depended entirely on his personal conduct remaining absolutely spotless. Bradley didn't know why. He never learned why. He simply found himself, over the following week, suddenly and inexplicably reluctant to so much as drive down Wren's street, a caution that felt, to him, like nothing more than good sense, though it had actually been planted in him by men he would never meet, on behalf of a woman he would never know had intervened. Wren noticed the silence and was grateful for it without understanding it. She assumed Bradley had simply gotten bored, the way rich men eventually got bored of anything that stopped being fun. She had no idea a mafia boss she'd never met in person had quietly, methodically made himself the reason her ex-boyfriend suddenly developed manners. It was 3 weeks into their strange, careful text message friendship before Enzo asked to meet her in person. "I'd like to buy you coffee," he wrote. "Not because I want anything from you. I just think I'd like your voice better than your texts." Wren stared at that message on her lunch break, sitting in her car in the hospital parking lot with a granola bar she wasn't eating balanced on the dashboard. Every rational part of her brain, the part trained by 3 years of triaging emergency rooms and knowing exactly how badly things could go wrong, told her that meeting a stranger from a wrong number, no matter how kind his texts had been, was a spectacularly bad idea. But the part of her that had spent 2 years being managed, minimized, and made to feel small by a man with a platinum card, wanted, badly, to know what it felt like to be looked at by someone who'd chosen her for no reason at all. "Public place," she wrote back. "Daytime, and I pick where." "Fair," he wrote. "Name it." She picked a small diner 3 blocks from the hospital, cracked vinyl booths and a bell over the door, a place so ordinary it felt like the safest possible setting for whatever this was about to become. She got there 10 minutes early on her day off, wearing jeans and a plain sweater instead of scrubs, and sat in the corner booth with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug she didn't need, watching the door. The bell jangled at exactly the time they'd agreed on. She looked up, expecting to have to search the room, and instead found her breath catching in her throat immediately, because there was no searching required. The man who walked in filled the doorway in a way that had nothing to do with height, though he had plenty of that, too. He wore a dark coat over a simple charcoal sweater, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed money the way Bradley's watches always had, and yet every single person in the diner, without seeming to decide to, glanced up and then quickly looked away. The particular reflexive deference of people who recognize danger without being able to name it. He found her immediately, as if he'd already known exactly where she'd be sitting, and crossed the room with an easy, unhurried stride that still managed to eat the distance fast. Up close, his eyes were dark, steady, and far more tired than his texts had let on, framed by the kind of faint lines that came from carrying more than most men carried in a lifetime. "Wren," he said, and just her name in his low, even voice did something strange and immediate to her chest. "Enzo." She gestured to the seat across from her, suddenly unsure what to do with her own hands. "You're taller than I pictured." A faint, genuine smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he slid into the booth. "You pictured me? Don't let it go to your head." He ordered black coffee when the waitress came by, and Wren found herself watching the way he did it. Quiet, direct, no unnecessary words, none of the performative charm Bradley used to smooth every interaction. It was, she realized slowly, the opposite of performance. He simply was who he was, and didn't seem to feel any need to convince anyone otherwise. "So," she said, wrapping both hands around her mug again. "What do you do, Enzo? You've been very mysterious for 3 weeks." "Import and logistics," he said, which was, technically, not a lie. "Shipping, mostly. Family business." "That sounds boring." "It's not," he said, and something flickered behind his eyes that she couldn't quite read. "It's demanding, and occasionally dangerous, if I'm being honest with you." "Dangerous how?" Do the boxes fight back? He laughed at that, a real laugh, low and surprised out of him, and she felt a small, private thrill at having caused it. Something like that, he said. Tell me about you. Nursing, that's not an easy job. It's not, she agreed, and found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, actually talking. She told him about the 12-hour shifts, about the trauma bay and the particular exhaustion that settled into your bones after enough overnight shifts, about her mother, who had died 8 months ago, and about how nursing had started as a way to make sure nobody else's daughter ever felt as helpless as she had, watching machines she didn't understand keep her mother alive for 6 extra weeks that hadn't been enough. Enzo listened the entire time without interrupting, his dark eyes fixed on her with an attention so total it made her feel, for the first time in 2 years, like the most interesting person in any room she'd ever been in. When she finished, embarrassed suddenly by how much she'd said, she laughed and pushed a hand through her hair. Sorry, that was a lot for a first coffee. Don't apologize, he said. I asked because I wanted to know. They talked for 2 hours. She learned that he'd lost his father young, that he had a younger cousin he was fiercely protective of, that he preferred rain to sunshine because rain gave a man an excuse to stay inside and think. He learned that she hated the smell of hospital disinfectant so much, she'd started wearing a specific lavender lotion just to have something else to smell on her hands. That she'd always wanted to see the ocean somewhere that wasn't a polluted city beach. That she laughed with her whole face when something actually struck her as funny, unguarded in a way that made something in his chest ache with a feeling he didn't have a name for. When the check came, he reached for it before she could, and she opened her mouth to argue out of pure reflex, 2 years of Bradley having trained her to expect a price attached to every meal a man paid for. Let me get this one, Enzo said, before she could speak, reading the argument in her face with an ease that unsettled her slightly. It's coffee, Ren, not a negotiation. She let him, and when they stood outside the diner in the thin afternoon light, neither of them quite ready to end it, he didn't reach for her hand or lean in the way she half expected. He just looked at her, steady and direct, and said, I'd like to see you again. No pressure, just say the word. I'd like that, she said, and meant it more than she'd meant almost anything in 2 years. She didn't know, walking back to her bus stop with her heart doing something complicated and warm in her chest, that 2 men in a parked sedan across the street had watched the entire exchange from a discreet distance, part of the security detail that now, without her knowledge, quietly accompanied Enzo Moretti to every meeting he took outside his own territory. She didn't know that the man she'd just spent 2 hours laughing with had, less than a month ago, ended a supply dispute with a rival organization by making it very clear, without raising his voice, that continued interference would not be tolerated. She only knew that for 2 hours she had felt entirely, uncomplicatedly seen, and that felt, after 2 years of Bradley Kane, like the beginning of something worth having. The weeks that followed unfolded in a slow, careful rhythm neither of them examined too closely. Coffee became dinner. Dinner became long walks along the river after her shifts, Enzo waiting outside the hospital in a car that never drew attention to itself. He never tried to impress her with money the way Bradley always had. He brought her soup when she came off a brutal double shift with a cold. He remembered, without being told twice, that she took her coffee with too much cream and hated when people rushed her while she was talking. Ren found herself, for the first time in years, looking forward to her days off instead of dreading the emptiness of them. She still didn't know exactly what he did. She'd stopped asking pointed questions, some instinct telling her that pushing too hard on that particular door would get her an answer she wasn't ready for, and some other, quieter instinct telling her that whatever it was, it explained the two men who always seemed to be somewhere nearby whenever she was with him, the way waiters and shopkeepers treated him with a deference that had nothing to do with how he actually behaved toward them. It was Marco who finally, bluntly, forced the issue, 3 weeks after that first diner coffee, cornering Enzo in the study with the particular blunt honesty only family could get away with. "You're bringing a civilian close, Enzo, a real one." Marco dropped into the chair across from the desk, his usual easy humor entirely absent. "I like her, but if you don't tell her the truth soon, someone else will, and it won't be gentle when it happens." Enzo didn't answer right away. He was looking at a framed photograph on the edge of his desk, his father in a suit, 20 years younger than Enzo was now, a man who had never once let anyone outside the family close enough to be used against him, and who had died anyway, of a heart that gave out under 30 years of exactly the kind of caution Marco was now urging on his son.
"I know," Enzo finally said. "I'm going to tell her." "When?" "Soon." He meant it. He fully intended to sit Ren down, somewhere quiet, and tell her the truth about the shipping company, about the men who called him boss instead of Enzo, about exactly what kind of danger she'd wandered into the night her thumb had slipped on a phone screen. He intended to give her every chance to walk away before she was in too deep to leave safely. He didn't get the chance to choose the timing himself. The timing chose itself, 4 days later, in the worst possible way. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of gray, unremarkable afternoon that gave no warning of what it was about to hold. Ren had just finished a day shift, walking to the small deli 2 blocks from the hospital where she liked to buy an overpriced sandwich as a reward for surviving a 12-hour rotation, when a black SUV pulled up alongside her, moving too slow to be anything but deliberate. 2 men got out. They weren't Enzo's men. That much registered immediately in some animal, instinctive part of her brain. A wrongness in how they carried themselves, aggressive where his people were watchful. "You're the nurse," one of them said, stepping into her path. He was broad, with a scar through one eyebrow, and said it the way you'd confirm an address, flat and certain. "Moretti's girl." Ren's heart slammed against her ribs. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you don't." The second man circled behind her, cutting off the sidewalk in both directions, and Ren felt the particular cold flood of adrenaline she usually only felt in a trauma bay, except this time there was no team around her, no protocol to fall back on, just her own 2 feet on a public sidewalk, and 2 strangers who clearly knew exactly who she was. "You're going to come with us," the first man said, reaching for her arm. "Boss wants to send a message. Nothing personal." Ren didn't think. 3 years of hospital training, the particular reflexes drilled into her by codes and combative patience, took over before fear could fully paralyze her. She twisted her arm out of his grip at the angle she'd learned to break a hold, and drove her elbow back hard into the second man's ribs as he grabbed for her shoulder, hard enough that he grunted and stumbled back a step, more startled than hurt. "Feisty," the first man said, unimpressed, closing the distance again, and this time his hand closed around her wrist hard enough to bruise, dragging her toward the open door of the SUV. She screamed, raw and desperate, and it was that scream, more than anything else, that saved her, because the deli owner 3 doors down started shouting from his doorway, and a woman walking her dog pulled out her phone, and the whole calculation of a quiet, deniable grab collapsed in an instant into something far too public and far too loud. "Let her go," barked the man with the scarred eyebrow to his partner, glancing at the gathering attention, and in the half-second of hesitation, Ren wrenched her wrist free and stumbled backward, catching herself against the brick wall of the deli, her breath tearing out of her in ragged gasps. The SUV peeled away from the curb before the sirens even started,
the two men gone as fast as they'd appeared, leaving Ren standing shaking on the sidewalk with a darkening bruise already blooming around her wrist, and the deli owner rushing out to steady her by the shoulders, asking if she was hurt, if she needed him to call someone. She called Enzo before she called the police. She didn't examine why in the moment. She just needed to hear his voice. He answered on the first ring, and something in her tone, wordless and shaking, brought a stillness into his own voice that she'd never heard from him before, cold and immediate. "Ren, where are you? Tell me exactly where you are." She told him, her voice cracking, and he said 3 words back, low and absolute. "Don't move. I'm coming." He was there in 11 minutes, in a car that broke every reasonable speed limit through the city's afternoon traffic. And when he got out, the deli owner took one look at the expression on his face and quietly, wisely, decided to go back inside and mind his own register. Enzo crossed the sidewalk in 3 long strides and stopped in front of Ren, his hands hovering just short of touching her, as if he needed permission first. Some new gentleness in him that hadn't been there in the business-like coffee and easy walks of the past few weeks. "Are you hurt?" "My wrist," she said, holding it up, the bruise already dark and ugly against her pale skin. I'm okay, Enzo. He took her wrist with a care that felt entirely at odds with the tight, controlled fury radiating off him in waves, turning it gently in the light to look at the bruising, his jaw tight enough that a muscle jumped near his ear. "Tell me what they looked like." She described them, the scar through one eyebrow, the build, the SUV, and watched something shift behind Enzo's eyes, a recognition she couldn't read but that clearly meant something to him, something that made his hands, still holding her wrist with careful gentleness, tighten fractionally at the knuckles. "I know who sent them," he said quietly. "Who?" Her voice was still shaking. "Enzo, who would want to grab me off the street? I'm nobody. I'm a nurse." He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, standing on a sidewalk with her bruised wrist held in his careful hands, Ren felt the last comfortable illusion of the last month finally start to crack open. "You're not nobody," he said finally. "You're someone connected to me, and that makes you a target for anyone who wants to hurt me without coming at me directly." He looked at her then, fully, and there was nothing evasive left in his expression, only a raw, exposed honesty that scared her more than the 2 men on the sidewalk had. "I should have told you the truth weeks ago. I didn't because I was a coward about it, and I'm sorry, because that cowardice just got you hurt." "Told me what truth?" "Get in the car," he said gently. "I'll explain everything, but not standing on a sidewalk where anyone can hear it." She got in the car. She told herself later it was because her legs were still shaking too hard to argue, but the truth, the one she didn't examine too closely in the moment, was that she trusted him, entirely and instinctively, in a way she'd never once trusted Bradley Kane in 2 full years. They didn't go to his home, not yet. He took her to a private, empty back room of a restaurant he apparently owned a piece of, sat her down across from him with a cup of tea she didn't touch, and told her the truth in plain, unflinching sentences, watching her face the entire time as if bracing for her to bolt. He told her about his family, about the business that wasn't shipping so much as territory, leverage, and careful, ruthless order kept over a piece of the city most people never saw the underside of. He told her, without softening it, that men had died at his order, that the 2 who'd grabbed her off the sidewalk had almost certainly been sent by a rival organization called the Rossettis, who had been probing at his territory for months and had finally found, in her, a soft place to press. Ren sat very still through all of it, her tea going cold, her bruised wrist resting in her lap, and when he finally finished, the silence stretched long enough that Enzo's jaw tightened, bracing himself for whatever came next. "You should have told me," she finally said. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Weeks ago, before I let myself—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. "You should have told me." "I know. I'm a nurse, Enzo. I patch up gunshot wounds twice a month and don't ask questions because that's my job. I'm not naive about what this city is." She looked up at him, and there was more steel in her eyes than he'd expected. More than Bradley Kane, in 2 years, had ever managed to notice was there. "I'm angry you didn't trust me with the truth. I'm not angry about what the truth is." "You should be scared," he said quietly. "You almost got hurt today because of me." "I am scared," she admitted. "But I'm not sorry I answered a wrong number 3 weeks ago." She reached across the small table, careful of her bruised wrist, and laid her hand over his, the first time she'd touched him with real deliberateness rather than the careful, accidental brush of two people learning each other's edges. "I need you to be honest with me from now on. All the way honest. That's the price of me staying." Enzo looked down at her hand over his, small and steady despite everything that had just happened to her, and felt something in his chest crack open in a way it hadn't in years. Maybe not since his father died and left him the particular loneliness of a man everyone feared and almost no one actually knew. "All the way honest," he agreed. "I promise you that." He kept his word starting that same night. He told her about the Rossetti family's recent aggression, about a young captain of theirs named Vittorio, who had a reputation for exactly this kind of ugly, indirect pressure. He didn't sugarcoat the danger she was in by association with him, and he laid out plainly what he intended to do about it. Increased security around her apartment and the hospital, a driver to and from her shifts, and his word that nobody would touch her again without answering for it. "I'm not going to hide you away like a prisoner," he said, sitting across from her in the quiet restaurant back room as the evening deepened outside. "You'd hate that, and you'd be right to. But I need you to let me protect you properly. No more walking home alone from the hospital. No more pretending this doesn't touch your life just because you didn't ask for it to." "Okay," Ren said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it without resentment. 2 years with Bradley had taught her to bristle at any man trying to manage her movements, but this felt different in a way she couldn't fully articulate. Maybe because Enzo asked instead of dictating. Maybe because the danger, this time, was real and not manufactured out of a rich man's insecurity. She moved into his penthouse 3 days later, not because he pressured her, but because after the second night of lying awake listening to every creak of her old building's pipes, she called him at midnight and simply said, "I don't want to be alone tonight." And he was there within 20 minutes with a bag already packed for her. The penthouse was nothing like she'd expected, less the cold marble fortress of every Mafia story she'd half absorbed from movies, and more a quiet, unshowy space of dark wood and good light. Marco, when she finally met him properly over a late dinner 2 nights in, greeted her with an easy warmth that told her plainly he'd already decided, on Enzo's account, to like her. "So you're the wrong number," Marco said, grinning as he passed her a plate. "I have to say, I expected someone with better sense than to end up dating a man who keeps 3 separate burner phones." "I didn't know about the burner phones when I fell for the texting," Ren said dryly, and Marco laughed, delighted, glancing at Enzo with a look that said, clearly, "I approve." Life in the penthouse settled into an unfamiliar but not unwelcome rhythm. Enzo left before dawn most mornings for meetings she still wasn't fully briefed on, and he was often gone late into the evenings, but he called every single night, without fail, sometimes for no reason other than to ask how her shift had gone, and she found in those calls a steadiness that 2 years with Bradley had never once provided. The trouble with the Rossettis did not resolve itself quietly. 10 days after the sidewalk incident, Enzo's security detail intercepted a second attempt at the hospital's parking structure, a crude effort to plant a tracking device on her car that one of his men caught before it ever activated. Enzo told her about it that same evening, calm and direct, and watched her take the news with the same steady composure she'd shown from the very beginning. "They're testing how far they can push," he told her, sitting across from her at the kitchen island while she picked at a plate of food neither of them had much appetite for. "Vittorio wants a war. His father, Salvatore Rossetti, is smarter, and he's been holding him back, but that leash is getting shorter." "What happens if there's a war?" Ren asked quietly. "People get hurt who shouldn't," Enzo said honestly. "I'm trying to avoid that. I've reached out through the right channels to see if this can be settled without bloodshed. Sometimes that works. Sometimes it doesn't." It didn't. Not entirely. Not without one final, frightening night that neither of them would forget. It happened 3 weeks after Ren moved into the penthouse, on an evening when Enzo had insisted she stay in rather than pick up an extra shift, some instinct in him restless and uneasy. Marco was out running an errand for the family, and the penthouse's usual rotation of security had been thinned by 2 men shadowing a shipment that night, a gap that had clearly been noticed and planned around. The intrusion wasn't cinematic chaos. It was quieter and, in its own way, more frightening. A service entrance alarm that chirped once and went silent too fast. A door standing very slightly ajar when Enzo passed it, and then, in the dim hallway light, a man Ren didn't recognize, young, tense, holding a knife rather than a gun, clearly under orders to make a point rather than a kill. "Enzo!" Ren said sharply from the kitchen doorway, and the intruder's head snapped toward her voice, giving Enzo the half-second he needed. He moved fast, faster than a man his size had any right to move, closing the distance and driving his shoulder into the intruder before the man could fully turn the knife toward either of them. They went down hard against the hallway wall, a framed photograph shattering off its hook, and Ren's training took over even as her heart screamed at her to run, her body already moving toward the kitchen counter for anything that could be used as a weapon or a tool, whichever came first. The fight was brief and ugly, nothing like the choreographed violence of a movie. Enzo took a shallow slice along his forearm defending against the blade, a wound that bled fast and looked far worse than it was, and the intruder took a hard elbow to the jaw that dropped him to the floor, half-conscious, groaning, the knife skittering harmlessly across the hardwood. "Enzo, your arm," Ren said, already moving, the nurse in her overriding every other instinct, grabbing the kitchen towel off the counter and pressing it firmly against the shallow gash before he'd even fully caught his breath. "I'm fine," he said, though his jaw was tight with pain, watching her work with a kind of stunned, grateful focus. "Ren, hold still. It's not deep, but head wounds and arm wounds bleed like they want an Oscar. Let me look." She peeled back the towel, assessed the cut with the same clinical calm she brought to every trauma bay shift, relief flooding through her when she confirmed what she already suspected. "You'll need a few stitches, but you're going to be fine. Do you have a first aid kit anywhere in this fortress of yours?" A ghost of a smile crossed his face, despite everything. Second bathroom cabinet. Marco arrived 11 minutes later, having been called the second the alarm chirped. 2 more of Enzo's men right behind him, and the intruder, still groggy on the hallway floor, was hauled up and questioned in a back room, while Ren sat Enzo down at the kitchen island and stitched the shallow wound closed herself, her hands steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her, murmuring instructions to herself the way she did during any procedure, half for her own focus and half, this time, for his comfort. "You didn't run," Enzo said quietly, watching her work, his voice low with something that wasn't quite disbelief, but was close to it. "I'm a nurse, Enzo. I don't run from blood. I run toward it. She tied off the last stitch, cleaned the wound one more time, and finally allowed herself to exhale, her hands trembling now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go. You scared me half to death, though. Don't do that again. I'll do my best, he said, and reached up with his uninjured hand to brush a strand of hair back from her face, his touch far gentler than the violence that had just torn through his home. Thank you for not running. I told you, she said, her voice unsteady but certain. I'm not going anywhere. The man Marco's people questioned that night confirmed what Enzo had already suspected. Sent by Vittorio Rossetti, acting without his father's sign-off, hoping to prove himself capable of striking directly at Enzo Moretti. By the following morning, Salvatore Rossetti himself had reached out through back channels, mortified and furious in equal measure, offering a formal apology and a promise that his son's unsanctioned aggression would be dealt with, permanently, from within his own house. The war Enzo had been quietly bracing for never fully materialized. Vittorio was reined in, publicly humiliated within his own organization, and the fragile, wary peace between the two families held, brittle but intact. Ren's wrist healed within a week, the bruise fading to a pale, forgettable yellow. Enzo's arm healed within 2, the stitches she'd placed herself leaving a thin, clean scar he would, months later, only half-jokingly refer to as her signature. Life, in the strange, careful way it does, began to settle. Ren kept her job at the hospital, refusing every gentle suggestion from Enzo that she consider something safer. I didn't become a nurse to hide from difficult things, she told him, and he learned, slowly, to stop suggesting it. She learned, in turn, to live with the parts of his life she couldn't change. The men at the door, the vetting of every new person who entered her life, the late nights when he came home tense from problems he couldn't fully share. Loving a man like Enzo Moretti meant loving the whole complicated weight of him, not just the gentle, steady parts that had shown up in a diner booth on a gray afternoon. 3 months after that first wrong number text, on an evening when the city had finally warmed into something resembling spring, Enzo took her up to the roof of the penthouse building, a space she hadn't known existed, quiet and private above the noise below, strung with simple string lights he'd had someone put up that afternoon without telling her. "What is this?" she asked, laughing, turning in a slow circle to take it in. "A thank you," he said, "for not being scared away by any of this." "I was scared," she admitted, coming to stand beside him at the railing, looking out over the city lights spread beneath them. "I'm still scared, sometimes, but I've never once regretted answering that text." "Neither have I," Enzo said, and reached into his coat pocket, his voice steadier than the moment probably warranted, though his hands, she noticed, weren't quite as steady as his tone. "I know this is fast. I know what I am, and I know what loving me costs. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't, but I've spent my whole life being careful not to want anything I couldn't afford to lose. And then a woman with a wrong number and a tired voice broke every single one of those rules in about 3 weeks, and I haven't wanted to go back since." He held out a small velvet box, and Ren's breath caught somewhere behind her ribs, her eyes stinging before she'd even fully processed what he was asking. "I'm not asking you to marry me tonight," he said quickly, reading the sudden overwhelm on her face. "I'm asking you to let this be real, officially, publicly. No more careful distances, no more protecting you by keeping you half in the dark. I want the whole city to know exactly whose you are, so nobody ever mistakes you for an easy target again." He paused, and something raw and unguarded moved across his face, an honesty she'd learned, over 3 months, was rarer in him than almost anything else. "I want to be yours the same way, if you'll have me." Ren looked at the box, then at him, at the steady dark eyes that had never once, in 3 months, looked at her like she was an asset to be managed or a hobby to be tolerated, and she felt the last, careful walls she'd built after 2 years with Bradley Kane come down all at once, painless and complete. "Yes," she said, laughing through the sudden tears blurring her vision. "Yes, obviously yes, you dramatic, overprotective, absolute menace of a man." He laughed too, low and surprised and entirely unguarded, and pulled her into him with a gentleness that still, even now, sometimes startled her, given everything else he was capable of. "I love you," he said against her hair, the words simple and unadorned, exactly the way everything true between them had always been. "I've loved you since a wrong number told a stranger she was done being unhappy." "I love you too," Ren said, and meant it with the same steady certainty she brought to every difficult, unflinching thing in her life. "Even though you scared the life out of me more than once." "I promise to work on that," he said, though the small, wry smile on his face suggested he wasn't entirely convinced he could keep that particular promise, given the life he led. "I'll hold you to it," she said, and kissed him under the string lights on a roof above a city that, somewhere down below, still didn't know that its most dangerous man had just been quietly, thoroughly claimed by a 22-year-old nurse who'd simply refused to be unhappy anymore. Bradley Kane never learned the full truth of who had quietly rearranged his business relationships and his manners in the weeks after Ren left him. He moved on, eventually, to another woman he could manage and diminish, never realizing how close he had come to serious trouble. Ren, when she thought of him at all, felt nothing sharper than a distant, fading pity, the particular numbness of realizing a person who once felt enormous in your life has simply stopped mattering. She still worked her 12-hour shifts. She still came home some nights too exhausted to do anything but collapse against Enzo's chest and let him hold the weight of her day. She still wore her light blue scrubs, stained at the cuffs no matter how carefully she washed them, and Enzo still, without fail, had a car waiting outside the staff entrance every time her shift ended. It hadn't started the way any love story was supposed to start. There had been no meet cute, just a thumb slipping on a phone screen at 2 a.m, and an honest, exhausted sentence meant for a man who'd never deserved to read it. But sometimes, Ren had come to believe, the wrong number was exactly the right one. And sometimes, the most dangerous man in the city turned out to be the only one who ever made her feel entirely, uncomplicatedly safe. A wrong number changed everything for Ren Ashcroft, turning a moment of heartbreak into the beginning of a love she never saw coming. Do you think she made the right call staying after everything that happened? Or was it too big a risk for a girl just trying to survive her own life? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story pulled you in, hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a slow burn, and subscribe for more gripping mafia romance stories every week. See you in the next one.